I'm not a First Nations person, and I'm not even a scientist. So I don't know if that actually qualifies me perfectly for this role or disqualifies me entirely. But what we're going to do now, I think we're ready, the screen's up, right? Is that the three first speakers are going to join me here. We're going to get a discussion going, but we're not going to take a huge long time to do that. I have about 100 questions, but I'm only going to ask about 3. We'll have a discussion, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from all of you. So I don't know that there's a specific order we have to sit in, but I know I'm supposed to sit here. And Rob, even though you spoke last, I'd love to start with you, because at the very end of your talk, you talked about importing, I think was the word you used, native science into your work. And then you stopped. And I want to know, I'd like to get a better idea of what that looks like.
Well, 15 minutes goes by pretty quick.
Yeah.
And I, had probably 5 or 6 more large thoughts that I did want to complete there. So, what did I stop there for? The idea that that everything is interrelated and interconnected is a very recent discovery in Western medicine, or Western science, but it is something that has been talked about for millennia in virtually all Aboriginal societies. So importing it is actually, the empiricism of it, and as our second commentator there pointed out, is really excludes anything that doesn't meet these strict guidelines. And I think that a lot of biologists would agree that thinking holistically has led to incredible advances in modern medicine. Just in the last few years, incredible things are being discovered by considering more holistically a system of biology. So I guess that's sort of what I meant.
So, but okay, I won't sort of pursue you on this too much, but you're looking for asteroids. So, as you import native thought to your life, can you bring that into that specific example? See, what I'm trying to do here is not be skeptical, but to say, okay, we think that there's usefulness in both of these ways of thinking, but how exactly can we sort of bring them together? And so that's why I asked you that, because you're doing a pretty hard-nosed, mechanistic, maybe kind of science, and yet you're wanting to import this holistic kind of thinking. And I don't know whether they can really coexist.
Oh, absolutely they can. I mean, the example that I used of life springing from stone, and that's how we got here. Well, we still don't know how that happened.
Right.
Right. All that we can agree on is that we're here, and before there was us, it was all rocks. And so importing that idea is in a native spiritual cultural sense, those rocks and stars and things in the sky beings are our relations. We know that we're related to them. We already, they're our family. And so bringing those ideas together, I mean, it's not necessarily going to help you find any particular asteroid to talk about it this way, but it might give you some respect for the asteroid that you do find. And the idea that really wasn't touched on, I think, by any of us, is that so many ceremonies, rituals, and basically every rite of passage and stuff in Aboriginal ceremony and life is a transaction. There's an offering that's made and something is received. It's a transaction. So this transaction that I propose, that we grab asteroids and take that material and help us further our agenda, is a transaction. And having this idea of having a certain amount of respect, that you are changing, something that has been held sacred and been out, in space for billions of years. Yeah. I think that having that idea of respect is something that really is lacking in Western empiricism.
So it's interesting that all three of you used physics and astronomy as your science examples to show us the complementarity between native thought and empirical science. Is there something special about astronomy, cosmology, and physics that makes that clearer or easier? I'd throw that open to anybody.
Well, I would say that, you know, as I said in the talk, I could have come at this from multiple perspectives. And so I truthfully chose it because I knew that Robert was coming. So I chose astronomy because I thought that was a kind of concrete example. But not necessarily. I mean, what I talked about in terms of native science really applies to, you know, all of the interrelationships. So cosmology and astronomy represent one kind of level of understanding and perspectives that, in a sense, as I said before, Native people try to establish a resonance with that,
Leroy?
with that process. Yeah.
I think it was Gary Zukav, in one of his books, said at one time we used to go and ask the church, what is it all about? Okay? You know, the loaded question. Why are we here? What is it all about? And sooner or later, we started to discover that the church didn't quite give us the answer. So 300-400 years ago, we turned over to the scientists. And we gave everything over to the scientists and told them, as Zukov says, why don't you go and find out for us what it's all about while we go and play bingo? And after 300-400 years, the scientists are coming back and they are saying, we still don't know what it's all about. We think the answer is in you, okay? Well, who are those people that we are sending out to go and find out what it's all about? Well, they're the cream of the crop. They're the quantum physicists, they're the astronomers, and so on. They're the scientists. That's who we rely on, see? And so, at least for me, it is the reason why we engage in dialogues with them. In other words, let's talk to the upper echelons and see where they're coming from and see if there's any similarities, differences, and if there are similarities, hey, is there a chance that we can cooperate and work together? Say. So that's why I speak to, and that's why I use physics as a basis for comparison.
Do any of you see any really strong hope? Let me back off from that a bit. I know a lot of scientists who see themselves as being extremely busy, writing grant proposals, not having them accepted, running a big lab, not being quite as open as E.O. Wilson might have suggested science to be. But so do any of you see positive signs where Western scientists are becoming, or are showing signs of becoming, more open to incorporating these other ways of seeing the world?
The dilemma is that scientists are not taught in terms of really some of these alternative views and perspectives. It's science teaching, especially as you move up in the system, becomes more and more specifically a transfer of very particular kinds of technical knowledge and theory.
Yeah.
And actually the problem is really how the scientist is taught. until we begin to change our curriculum, in a sense, the big picture, it's going to be a struggle, for those, because education is a conditioning process. It creates habits of mind, orientations, and understandings. And so unless we begin to change the curriculum, we'll probably continue to have conflict, in terms of the two worldviews. I see that the real potential and almost the need is to create a kind of education process that allows for intuition, allows for an honoring of perspectives that Indigenous people have always had, which is beginning to happen somewhat in at least the life sciences, biological sciences, in terms of interdependence and holistic thinking. Complex adaptive system is a theoretical idea, comes from ecology, that is very Indigenous in terms of its way of thinking about how things happen to a certain level. So it really comes down to an educational issue. It's about epistemology, how you come to know what you know. And
Which has to happen long before people become professional scientists.
Right. So it's an evolutionary process.
I think there's more intuition in science than we might be allowing.
Well, it's not.
But they don't.
admitted.
But nobody likes to admit it.
Admit
right?
it, yeah.
I mean, but Barbara McClintock figuring out that genes were jumping around in corn. I mean, that was an intuition that then had to be backed up by experimentation.
Sure, there's a lot of scientists that are starting to think more and more, especially those people working in quantum physics and so on. Roger Penrose is a good example. Capra is a good example. The late David Bohm, David Peat are good examples. People who are willing to cross the borders a little bit and so on. But yes, I agree, there's still the majority of scientists who don't think too much about it because they're having too much fun simply saying, let's go and explore, without really examining the foundational and philosophical basis of science.
So then are you three the equivalent on the other side of Bohm and Peat and people like that? That is exploring Western science from your perspective, and they are exploring native science from their Western perspective.
Who might say that? But, it has really been a lifelong interest for me. So I've always been interested in dealing with the unknown.
That's what it's all about. I think it'd be a perfect moment at this point, dealing with the unknown, to invite any of you in the audience who have a question for any of the three here, or in fact our two commentators, because I think they have access to microphones as well. And we have two people with microphones because we need to record all this. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic. Please be patient. Don't speak till the mic's right in front of you. And here's a question right here.
Great, thank you. My name's Carson Hoyer. I really appreciated the discussion so far. I have two questions. The first one is, to Harvey's point, this metaphor of the mixing of the glacial waters and the clear waters, and sort of unifying the two streams, if you will, of thought. For me personally, trained as a scientist, but also having had experience directly with nature that have given me a window into native spirituality. Sometimes it's the convergence of those ideas, the two different methods, if you will, or two different approaches confirm one another. That's one of the most powerful things for me, that points to the light towards there's really something to this. And so I would just ask, do you think the convergence is really necessary, or unifying them, or is the convergence itself this sign for us to take note where there's agreement? And so that's one question. And the second one, I'll just jump in here too, is, I'm fascinated by intuition as well. And I wonder, would you think that maybe within the context of some of the things that were shared tonight, Robert especially, that intuition actually has its root in stardust itself, in our great origins, and how it actually forms thought in our very own beings.
Well, that's another great mystery that has not been cracked by science, is our conscious thought, and what drives those ideas. How does an idea spark in our head? I'm not sure that all questions can be answered literally, either in an empirical sense or even in a holistic sense. Some parts of nature must simply be taken as seen, and not everything. See, that's as was mentioned by our second commentator, was that by observing something, you actually are changing it, right? And Leroy talked about making these weak measurements, where they're trying to make measurements without actually altering the system that they're measuring, but they can't quite do it. They just do it a little bit. So there are, I believe, ways to incorporate the holism of native thought and epistemology, and applying it not directly to, say, finding asteroids or finding a new medicine, although finding a new medicine would be quite a good application, but to the whole system of science, the education, as Greg mentions, the economies of it, the ability to manage your ecology. These are the places where you're going to get your biggest bang from your buck. And so, empirical science will always be empirical science, and you will be able to train scientists in ways to think more holistically. But that's not necessarily going to change their mathematics, right? At the end of all of my study of mathematics and physics and logic, you end up essentially like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics has its own mirror in mathematics called the Gödel incompleteness theorem, which states that under no axiomatic system can you answer all questions. They cannot all be answered from within a single axiomatic system of, say, mathematics.
Yeah.
So,
if you look at science, there's science of the local, and that's the local is where we operate as humans. That's what sometimes we refer to reality. But then there is the science of the small, which is what quantum physics deals with, and there's the science of the big, which was Einstein's field with gravity and so on. Well, one of the problems that arises is that all the methodology that we apply arises out of the science for the local. And we're trying to measure it, and we're trying to take that and use that in the science of the small, where it just doesn't work. And it just doesn't work in the science of the big either. All you have to do is stop and think about dreams. The physical laws that we're familiar with in a state of awakeness are just not applicable in dreams. See? And so that's kind of the thing we say, is that trying to impose the science that we see in our state of awakeness, in the science of the local, and applying it to these other areas, the big and the small. That's where, I think some additional thinking and this holistic notion can come in.
I think it's actually, no matter what approach one takes to anything, it pays to be a little bit skeptical of yourself. I'll give you an example from science. For a long time, scientists thought birds were very dumb. And in about 2005, a consortium of scientists published a big paper showing that because the belief had been for 100 years that the bird's brain was organized in a way that it couldn't possibly be intelligent because it didn't parallel the structure of the mammalian brain. Then in 2005, they published this paper saying, look, just because it's organized differently and it had been named, it had been given these pejorative names like the archaeocortex instead of, like an ancient cortex, well, it can't be very smart. And then virtually as soon as there was this realization that, yes, the bird brain functionally or structurally could be intelligent, suddenly there's this explosion of experiments showing just how damn smart they are. And I think that's a perfect example of how, and I'm a big fan of science, but how a particular attitude born of history can linger way too long and lead people down the wrong path for a long time. Whereas, any native person in Canada would know that the raven is an incredibly smart bird. They would just know that. Why? Because they weren't thinking about how whether it was nuclei or layers in their cortex. They were just watching it behave, and they knew it was smart.
That's a great example.
Question in the front here.
My name's Lee Crowchild. I've, in the application of science in the work that I've done, I found what the biggest struggle was. This idea of Western science is about dominion, and that dominion is, and I think that comes from maybe the Christian roots of
Absolutely.
Of that, because that creates ownership. And in Western science, from what my experience has been, is that ownership, it leads to authority. Authority is, and that leads to documentation. Licensing permits, these certificates that we have to go through. Where in the traditional practice, it's not about that. It's about relationship. And I know I've been working even on my own tribe, on Sotena, and I'm trying to get across this idea. We in this land reclamation that we're struggling with right now, we have to talk about these other things that Western science won't understand. About the ceremonies of medicine plants and how we have to move them. About the little people that exist there and how we're impacting them. Not just the animals and the plants, but these things that operate in the spiritual world. Because in our Sotena life ways, in our traditions, and that, everything is equal. You got your natural world, you got your spiritual world, you got your human world. And we can link between all those back and forth and up to our traditional life ways now. There's, it goes all the way. And science, because Western science doesn't allow for that, because to create a balance in there, I believe that we have to talk about decolonization. And as soon as you bring that up, and science says, whoa, wait a minute here. That doesn't fit into how we operate here. And so there's where the struggle is. When you ask the question about how to make it fit, I don't think, until we actually talk about the processes of decolonization, that it'll always be a struggle back and forth in that. But I think that was just more a comment rather than a question. Thank you.
Yeah. If I might go back to one of the thoughts that I just had, in my Pueblo's traditions, in Pueblo stories, of course, all our stories are sacred, so we can just paraphrase them. So, we have an entity that we call Thought Woman, and lots of traditions and ideas associated with her. But that Thought Woman thinks us into the world, has thought the world into being, and that that power of thought that actually has energy and it has a beingness, onto itself, and that thoughts have a life of their own, and they come into being when they're needed, and they go back to sleep when they're not needed, and then they come back into being when they're needed. So we go into these cycles of history that characterize human societies. So the question is, who is the thinker thinking the thought? And so that becomes a very important kind of understanding that Native traditions have among them, among themselves. So it's not so much trying to figure out completely who the thought woman is, but understand that it's important to resonate with her, the essence of her thought, which is about interdependence, interrelationship, all of these other things that I talked about. So that just gives you some insight. Then there's this thing called dark matter. So in some ways, it's true that it seems to have, we've been created from nothing, but actually, if you look at it from another perspective, there's not such thing as nothing. There's this thing that is a kind of primordial soup out of which arises everything. And so you think about those thoughts, and that's very much paraphrased in many of our stories about thought woman, and also the primacy of, because in many ways, brain research is beginning to show us empirically, but things that we've known indigenously, that the human mind and mind as a result of the processes of the brain is the manifestation of thought woman in each human being. And so the thought is a very important kind of metaphor for what organizes the world. Again, coming from different worldviews, Indigenous science comes from a different worldview, absolutely, and I showed you that. Western science, and I would say modern Western science and modern Western worldview, because Western worldview at one time was very aligned with the Indigenous as well. But modern Western worldview, the axiology is the focus on the material object. The process is through being able to replicate, mass produce. The epistemology is coming to know is through counting and measuring, and so those aspects of Western worldview, which are really modern and informed by the evolution of science and the history of science itself, are really what we're talking about in terms of that conflict. So how do you bridge that conflict? And that becomes an education issue. And how do you educate for understanding that both have worth in certain contexts, and how to combine them together becomes the issue.
I think we have time for one more question.
I had a question as a follow-up to the gentleman in the front row. And a few years back, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Deborah McGregor out of the University of Toronto, who's a prominent Aboriginal thinker and scholar within the field of traditional knowledge and its convergence with Western science. And Dr. McGregor often talks about the issue of power imbalances when dealing with Native communities or Native people, when they're dealing with the status quo. And she also extends that to when we think about traditional knowledge or other forms of knowledge with respect to its relationship to Western science. So the question I had for the panel was, do you find or do you feel that this is a significant barrier? So the issue of power imbalances and how that may serve as a barrier to the proper convergence of traditional knowledge and Western science. Do you find that this is a significant barrier, and as to why perhaps we have not been able to effectively and or collaboratively sort of merge those two forms of knowledge?
I would say absolutely. It is as an Indigenous scholar in a mainstream research university, I would say absolutely. It is a hegemony that is created through the ways and the foundation of epistemology that Western higher education, Western education as a whole, grows from. And and that's why I keep saying it is an educational issue that has those social, economic ramifications. It's an epistemological issue. And until we're able to resolve those power differences, Indigenous people will continue to struggle, within all Western education systems. That being said, Indigenous people must reclaim their traditions if we're going to begin to sustain and survive into the next generations. So it's a double whammy, and I have some ideas, but solutions are a result of collaboration and those kinds of ways of thinking and knowing that Western science, Western education doesn't teach for. It's about community also.
Well, I'd like to thank all our participants tonight, Leroy, Greg, Rob, Doris, Harvey, and thank you all for being an attentive audience and providing great questions. Thanks a lot.